Greetings, everybody. My name is Keith Blackmore, one of the producers for the Spark Animation Festival. Today, we're stepping into the fascinating world of animation through the eyes and expertise of a true luminary in the field, Jerry Beck. Jerry is a walking encyclopedia of animation history. With a career spanning several decades, Jerry has firmly established himself as one of the most foremost authorities on animation, making him an invaluable treasure trove of knowledge. And of course, as an animation historian, Jerry has dedicated his life to preserving this rich history of this art form. He's a passionate advocate for both classical and contemporary animation, which helps bridge the golden age of animation and the cutting edge of innovations today. Now, along the way, of course, Jerry's written a number of books on animation, offering deep insights into the works of legendary animators, studios, and the evolution of animation techniques. And so his contributions as well, they've extended beyond the written word. He's been involved in curating exhibitions, programming film festivals, lecturing on animation history at all kinds of esteemed institutions. Jerry's dedication to preserving the magic of animation and sharing it with the world has made him a beloved figure in the animation community. And so today, we're going to take a deep consideration of the Looney Tunes animation history through the discerning eyes of the one and only Jerry Beck. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. And when you said I was a luminary, I thought you were going to say I was a loony something or other, but I'm very, that was a great introduction. It was too much, literally, but thank you. And I'm happy to be here and share any information I can. Today, you asked me to talk about the Warner Brothers cartoons. Gee, I wonder if I know anything about the Warner cartoons. I think I might know a little bit about the history of it. And I've got some PowerPoint, slides and things to illustrate some of the information about the early days of the Looney Tunes and into their prime when they were the top of the hill in the 1940s and 50s. So if you'd like, I can start my my little presentation and
let's do it, Jerry.
Where it begins. All right. Here we go. We'll see how this works. Hold on a moment now. When I talk about Warner Brothers, we start with Leon Schlesinger. Leon Schlesinger's name, many of you have seen on the credits of the classic Looney Tunes of the 30s and 40s. It always says Looney Tunes produced by Leon Schlesinger. I remember when I was a kid, I wondered who that guy is. Wow, I want to be like Leon Schlesinger. He's cool. I want to be like Leon Schlesinger. He's really, really cool. And he was really cool, in my opinion. And I think if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have had the Warner Brothers cartoons as we know them. He was a theater manager. He was an entrepreneur. He came out to California in the 20s and bought the company that became Pacific Title. Pacific Title still exists today. It was the number one place in Hollywood for people to get their title cards, the opening titles and the intertitles, in silent movies back in those days. And of course, as this trade ad says, they did hand lettering and a little bit of animation and all sorts of stuff. Had quite a thriving business. In fact, he was extremely best friends, I'd say, with the Warner Brothers themselves. He was like a family friend. They needed him. He needed them. But when the Jazz Singer came to be and Warner Brothers began getting committed to sound movies, Leon sort of panicked and so did Hollywood. Hollywood title makers in Hollywood like Leon thought that's the end of their business. When there's talkies, who's going to need, intertitles in movies? So, and as you may recall, there were some early talkie films, like from 1928-29, that start with human beings, ushers, usherettes of the theater on screen saying the titles of the movie. MGM presents, Clark Gable in, that kind of thing. And they give all the credits vocally. Well, that didn't work. It didn't catch on. You got to remember that when movies began, the idea of sound movies, it wasn't instantaneous the way we have it today, the way we had it in 1933. In the very beginning, people just thought of talkie movies as seeing a play. When you go see a play on Broadway or anywhere, you walk into the theater, you're handed a program with all of the credits, and then you sit in the theater, the curtain opens, the play begins. There are no titles. People thought of the early talkie movies in that same fashion. It didn't work that way, ultimately. Titles, opening credit titles and end titles certainly still existed for movies. Intertitles were no longer, but Leon was not hedging his bet. He wanted to know what he could do to be part of where the business was going. He could see change was afoot. Warner Brothers sort of threw him a bone and said, "Look, we like every other studio in Hollywood. We need cartoons." Suddenly, in 1928, 29, actually, at 30, every studio in Hollywood, and 90% of them had no affiliation or interest in animated cartoons before that. But suddenly with talkies, suddenly with Disney, suddenly with Mickey Mouse creating a sensation, the public wanting cartoons with movies, the movie companies had to provide cartoons. There was so much demand. There weren't enough cartoons. Disney couldn't fill all the bill. So suddenly every studio in Hollywood was making an equivalent of Mickey Mouse-like cartoons. Some of Disney's associates even broke off from Disney and started making cartoons for some of the Hollywood studios independently. One group was Harmon-Ising, Hugh Harmon and Rudolph Ising, who were two of Disney's chief animators in Kansas City, who came out to work on Disney's Alice comedies and Oswald the Rabbit cartoons, and then split with Disney with the coming of sound, decided to strike out on their own. Their timing, of course, was perfect because Hollywood was looking for exactly Disney veterans who would happily supply Disney-like cartoons to the other studios. They set up their own studio, Harmon-Ising Productions, and they went to see many of the studios for possible distribution. One of the studios they went to was Warner's. They were directed to Leon Schlesinger, and Leon quickly and wisely made a deal with Harmon-Ising to start supplying cartoons featuring the very Mickey Mouse-like Bosco character that they had concocted. Bosco, the Talk Inc. Kid, was the name of the character. He would be their new Mickey Mouse. Leon and Warner's already came up with the series titles, play on silly symphonies. Looney Tunes first. And here's a trade ad. Leon Schlesinger is now producing for Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoons. It's interesting because Leon was an independent producing cartoons using a separate independent studio, Harmon-Ising, to make these cartoons. By the way, this trade ad, he, not forgetting he's still involved with Pacific Title, is listed at the bottom of this ad. Anyway, they started this new series. Warner Brothers only had one request, and that was that every cartoon that they released had to have a chorus of a song that Warner Brothers owned the rights to. They, of course, like every other studio in Hollywood, were making musicals. Of course, Warner's was making the big Busby Berkeley kind of musicals, and they had songwriters on staff who wrote a lot of those famous songs that are in those Gold Diggers films, things like that. And they wanted to sell the sheet music and get the music covered by performers. And they certainly, it wouldn't hurt to have the little cartoon that they now had to do. It was like a burden for them. But why not make it work for them by have the cartoon plug some of the songs they owned? The first Looney Tunes featuring Bosco comes out in 1930, September of 1930. The 1930-31 season. That's the way films were released back then. Not unlike later decades, when TV seasons would come on in September. Same thing. It started in the with movies way back into the silent era, that they sold the films in seasons, September through July, that kind of thing, or August, I guess. And Looney Tunes started in that season, and they were quite popular. Of course, they were, because they were very mimicked upon what Disney was doing. This was the trait that all the studios were doing back in the 1930s. There were no multiplexes back then. There were movie palaces. Here's the outside of a movie palace, the box office in the center. And if you look really close, you'll see there's what they call a sandwich board, a billboard there for a brand new Merrie Melodies cartoon, a second series that was started in 31. Looney Tunes would feature the star character, Bosco. Merrie Melodies was designed to be like Silly Symphonies, miscellaneous cartoons in each one. And as you can see, we'll look closer at that billboard there, a little sandwich board, one more time, featuring a character named Foxy. No resemblance to Mickey, huh? And by the way, every studio was pretty much ripping Mickey Mouse off until finally, about a year or two into it all, the Disney studio basically requested and asked everyone to stop. They even threatened one studio with a lawsuit. How dare they make cartoons with characters that look like Mickey? Well, everybody did it back then. Mickey was so popular. And that's the way the Warner Brothers cartoons began. Here's where I've got one of my embeds. Okay, oops. Okay. So when I have that, I have to. Anyway, the Merrie Melodies. Here's like the first one-sheet poster. By the way, all cartoons back then were given the star treatment. All of them back in the 30s into the 40s had their own publicity materials, movie posters, usually in the lobby. So people knew that the cartoons were playing at that theater. The Merrie Melodies. This poster looks like the advertising department really didn't understand what the Merrie Melodies were. They were song cartoons, it says. Great comedy, peppy tunes, zippy action. And they left the art department there to devise their own cartoon characters for this poster. Harmon-Ising wanted to imitate Disney in the worst way. They were in the best way. They really wanted to, keep up with Disney. All the studios in Hollywood wanted to keep up with Disney. Disney was leading the way and improving the artwork, storytelling, the visuals, everything. As the 30s went on, Disney, of course, had the ulterior motive of wanting to create an animated feature, Snow White. But the short subjects people were all trying to keep up with Disney, and Warner Brothers really didn't have any feeling to do that. Their attitude was, look, we just got to provide cartoons and we want to plug our songs. That's it. No extra money, not raising the budgets, not trying to compete with Disney. So Harmon-Ising, an independent studio, decided after 3 years, maybe we'll take MGM up on their offer. They apparently want to spend the money to make cartoons that look as good as Disney. They went over to MGM. They called the series over there Happy Harmonies, and brought Bosco with them, their character. They owned the character. All Warner Brothers really had was the names, Looney Tunes, Merrie Melodies, and that's all, folks. That was all they owned the rights to. Leon Schlesinger was still providing the cartoons, except he had no studio to do that with. So he immediately, in 1934, cobbled together with whoever wanted to remain, or anyone he could get, cast-offs from Disney or whatever, to create a brand new studio, Leon Schlesinger Productions, and come up quickly with a star character for the Looney Tunes while maintaining the miscellaneous song cartoon idea for the Merrie Melodies. The character they came up with was Buddy, which was really not much of a character, just a little boy, or sometimes a teenage boy, his girlfriend Cookie, his dog Towser, I'd have to say, I'd almost tell you this is the most forgotten star of Looney Tunes, except there's probably a few more, like the one I'm going to probably mention next. But Buddy starred in about a year's worth of cartoons, and it is pretty much promptly forgotten today. Leon had a lot of trouble finding appropriate animators to give his studio any kind of pep, to make his cartoons at least stand out a little bit from the crowd. You can hear, by the way, here's Universal. They were maintaining Oswald the Rabbit in the same style as Mickey Mouse, and this is true of all the other studios. I'm going to now cut to another PowerPoint, so this will be edited out. So bear with me a second while I do that. Hey, we got a visitor.
Yeah, this is Diego. Diego is one of my animation students, and he loves animation history, and he loves your work, Jerry.
Well, he will be the judge of how well this is going over. All right, bear with me. I'm going for PowerPoint number 2.
And we'll mute ourselves.
Continue the story from here, and we will continue. I got it. Got that up now. So here we go. I'm going to do the share screen. Going to get us right back to where we were, and we will continue this story. Now I'm going to go into this a bit, and then at some point I'm going to start doing the directors. So somehow I think we're going to pull this off, I think. So we'll see. All right. Okay. Here's a trade advertisement from roughly 1934 when poor Leon had really nothing to sell other than the name Looney Tunes, Merrie Melodies, and himself. This is quite the egotistical ad, in my opinion, but that's okay. Laughs are guaranteed, and there's Buddy and Cookie and a little squirrel who represents the Merrie Melodies, I guess. Starting out from scratch. Here's another trade ad. I want you guys to see as much Buddy as possible because you don't see Buddy that much. There you go. Here's Buddy from his very first title card. The Merrie Melodies by 1934 began using color. Disney had the exclusive from the Technicolor company for 3-color, full color, and it was exclusive for 2 or 3 years. So in 1935, Merrie Melodies went full color, 3-color Technicolor. And this poster is very interesting because they decided to just pull characters from a cartoon and make it look like, hey, we got cartoon characters galore. But these are actually all from a cartoon called I Haven't Got a Hat. I Haven't Got a Hat being a song that Warner Brothers owned the rights to, and the chorus of which is in this film. That cartoon is a parody of the old Our Gang, Little Rascals films, and the little kids in the class are all putting on a show. These are all the kids right here, and some of those kids are those 2 little pups that look like twins up there above the Merrie Melodies logo. That's their names were Ham and X. Get it? Very clever, huh? And the cat and the little pig were Porky and Beans. Haha, get it? Anyway, but they had this cartoon come out, and it was considered quite popular. Got some nice little trade reviews in Box Office Magazine and things like that. Leon was desperate, and he was like, all right, he looked at the characters, goes, okay, that Beans one looks like a cartoon character, the typical thing of today. So they starred Beans in a bunch of the Looney Tunes cartoons. He replaced Buddy. Porky, though, was in able support. Problem with Porky was he had that speech impediment. He had a stutter. They actually used, in very bad taste, they used a real stutterer who worked at the studio to record the lines. Well, that was funny. I say that with air quotes, for one off, but it wasn't really funny in many ways for other cartoons they recorded with this actual stutterer. And one of the problems, being more so than in being in bad taste, was that he truly had a speech impediment, and it literally took them, an hour to record his lines when it would normally take 15 minutes. So they knew they had to figure out something with this Porky Pig character. Oh, I'm going to jump back to that. Here's the lobby. Here's one of the publicity images for We Haven't Got a Hat, featuring the Our Gang crew. And as I mentioned, Porky was kind of stole the show with his recitation in it. That was all done with stuttering. The good news was, in 1936, a whole bunch of interesting creatives got hired by Leon, because Leon was hiring people as a revolving door in 35, 36, as they were looking for some take, something to emerge the characters and the cartoons in a different way from Disney, because following Disney was not a thing they could do at Warner Brothers anymore after 1934. Disney was going off in this feature direction, and the short cartoons they were making, they had limited budgets, they had other priorities. We had to figure out a new way forward. They brought in some very interesting people. I almost feel like it was fate or a fluke, but I'll give you their names real quick. He brought in that year, coincidentally, brand new voice guy to help with voices like Porky's, a guy who was a DJ, radio comedian, Mel Blanc. They brought in a new musician to pep up the music. That person's name was Carl Stalling, Carl W. Stalling. Quick backstory on him. He came from Kansas City, worked at the Newman Theater, where Walt Disney got his start, making very crude early cartoons in 1922-23 at the Newman Theater in Kansas. Carl Stalling was the only musician he knew. So when he started making his sound cartoons in 1928-29, he brought Carl Stalling out from Kansas City to score the Disney cartoons. Stalling is even the person who suggested the idea of the Silly Symphonies as a second series for Disney, which was brilliant, because that's new sound cartoons. The gimmick was sound, music. Silly Symphonies were born. Carl Stalling was that man. He freelanced a lot during the 1930s and then found his way to Warner's, where he permanently was there for the next 20 years till he retired. But he scored all the great Looney Tunes, all the great music you've heard. Either he created it or he scored it. He selected it, curated it. Fantastic. Also at that time, quickly, they brought in two other guys to be directors. Animators who really didn't quite direct at their other studios they were at, but they showed enough talent and charisma and personality in their interview with Leon to get the gig. And those two people were Fred Tex Avery. Fred Avery, also known as Tex Avery, who was working at the Walter Lantz studio in Story and as an animator. And now, if you know Tex Avery's style, you can easily go back to those early 30s Oswalds, and you can really pick out the gags that he put in the cartoons, because there are a lot of Avery-esque stuff going on there in those early cartoons. The other director they hired at that time was a young print cartoonist out of New York City who had worked for the Van Buren studio in New York. His name was Freleng Tashlin. I bet you've heard of Freleng Tashlin. He's more famous for his career after being in cartoons in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. He was uber famous for being a live-action feature film director of comedy films for Bob Hope, Martin and Lewis, Doris Day, and many, many other classics. But he got his first start being a director at the Looney Tunes Leon Schlesinger's studio. Let's see, did I mention everybody? I said Carl Stalling, Mel Blanc, Tex Avery, Freleng Tashlin. People who were already at the studio in lower positions as animators or in-betweeners were people like Chuck Jones. Friz Freleng was there as a director at this point because he had stayed with the studio. If I didn't mention Friz, I'll quickly mention him right now. But Friz was also a Disney animator from Kansas City. Came out to California in 1929 to work at Disney, but that didn't work out. So he ended up working for the Screen Gem studio and ended up at the very beginning of the Harmon-Ising studio. I think he even gets credit on that very first Looney Tune as the animator. And when Harmon-Ising left for MGM, Friz decided to stay with Leon, where he was promoted to full-fledged director, the senior director, and stayed pretty much, I said pretty much, with Warner Brothers through 1962 when they closed their studio. So he was pretty much a major director, Friz. And I also didn't mention Bob Clampett, who was an animator at this time, who would become a very big director later on. In fact, Chuck and Bob were in the Tex Avery unit. And by the way, this poster is very interesting because this is the madcap, Wild West that the Schlesinger studio was in 36. Tex Avery decided that Porky was a funnier character, or a character you can do more funny things with than Beans. Beans was generic. Beans was dull. Porky at least had some personality, even if it was a stutter. Soon to be a funny stutter or a funny speech impediment that Mel would give the character, a completely different take. But it's interesting, they had different units at Warner Brothers. Each director would have his own animators and their own little unit to direct each cartoon. This early poster with Porky out for the Looney Tunes reflects that, because if you look closely, all of the pictures of Porky on here, he's completely different looking. He's very obese in some of them. He's thinner in others. He's cuter in some. He's kind of grotesque in others. Very weird, but each unit had its own look for Porky Pig, and strangely enough, they promoted that. The Porky Pig cartoons of the 1930s this is what Warner's had. But what's interesting in watching them, especially if you can watch them in order, in fact, you can watch them in order, because I was involved with putting out a DVD set called Porky 101, which we include every black and white Looney Tune Porky Pig cartoon from 1935 through 1941 or so. And if you watch them, which I don't recommend anybody do in one setting, but if you somehow did do that, I actually had to do it to check the discs and make sure things were working. But if you did do that, you'd actually see the evolution of the Warner style grow cartoon by cartoon, year by year. And you can see the cartoons, Avery and Tashlin were the architects of a new thing, going for humor instead of Disney. Instead of doing Disney, we're going to do humor at this studio. And they took them 5 years. They didn't intentionally plan it like that, but if in a 5-year period, they evolved the studio to this new style. The cartoons became meta. The characters knew they were on screen. They talked to the audience. They broke the fourth wall. The gags were more topical than ever. Something I always like to remind people, especially my students where I teach, that these cartoons were never meant to be seen again. They were never meant to be seen in a DVD, Blu-ray box set back to back to back. They were meant to be seen once in a while in the movie theater. And they were of that moment. They were just like a newspaper comic strip. You read it today. You read Dennis the Menace today. You laugh and you throw the paper away. Well, that's how cartoons were considered back in the day. You saw it, and that was the end of it. There was no television. There was no aftermarket for cartoons. There was no home video streaming or physical media. So that's why there's a lot of topical humor in all these old cartoons. In the Porkies, they had the opportunity to introduce new characters. They finally hit upon a formula with Porky where he'd go out hunting. And in this one, Porky's Duck Hunt, he comes across a wacky, crazy, loony, nutty duck, or shall I say a Daffy duck. And that was a big hit. That was a big hit. But it's funny. The studio, the Leon, the theater people, they kept saying, "Oh, I like these hunting pictures. I like this duck hunt picture." The thinking at the studio was the hunting aspect of it was the star, was the thing that people were saying they liked. But what they really meant was they liked the duck. And so they ended up making a whole bunch of duck hunting cartoons, rabbit hunting cartoons. They finally realized Daffy was a formidable co-star, a little more Looney and a little more in the direction of the studio that was going. Porky was becoming a straight man. Here's a trade ad from, I guess this is like 38 or 39, actually, where Elmer has already been introduced. Looks a little different in those early films. And, this is what Leon had. By the way, at this point, although Porky was popular and known and merchandisable, even though that was going on, Leon's cartoons were not number one in the box office polls. The number one thing in the late 30s was Popeye from the Fleischers. That was the biggest character of that time. Number two would have been Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and Goofy and the characters that Disney was doing. Maybe number three, I'd have to go back and look, might be Porky Pig and the Looney Tunes. So they were still fishing for what they were doing. But while they were doing it, they were having a good time. By the way, in this later 30s period, most other studios were still doing the let's copy the Disney formula. Here's the one-sheet poster for Looney Tunes in 1940. And Porky and Daffy are the lead characters. Okay. Porky and Wacky Land. This is the lobby card for one of the shorts from 1930. I think 37 is this cartoon. It's pretty wacky. It's pretty surreal. Bob Clampett channeling Salvador Dali. This time, Porky is hunting the rare dodo bird, who's just as crazy as Daffy Duck or the forthcoming Bugs Bunny. Okay, bear with me. Oops. Okay. Porky's Hare Hunt, also in 1930, had another zany, crazy hunting cartoon. This was the pattern at the studio at that time. Once again, having now established Daffy as a separate character, similar response was coming in on this nutball, screwball rabbit. And so the thinking was, they finally got around to thinking the rabbit. We got to figure out something with this rabbit. Took a while. Every director had a shot at making a hunting cartoon with the zany rabbit idea. The character was not established. This model sheet, drawn by Charles Thorson, one of the great character designers of the 1930s, worked for every studio. This was for a cartoon that was being done by a very short-lived unit at Warner Brothers, one that was run by an animator named Ben Hardaway. Ben Hardaway directed only for about a year and then moved over to the Walter Lantz studio. But he had a shot at doing a rabbit cartoon, and his nickname was Bugs Hardaway. That's what they called him at the studio. Now, Bugs, as you may know, was a word back then that meant crazy, nuts, loony. If you were nutty, if you were crazy, they sent you to the bug house. That's what Bugs stood for. Of course, the name Bugs Bunny makes complete sense now as the name of this character. But this model sheet, where you can see at the bottom, it says Bugs's Bunny with an apostrophe. It meant that this is for Ben Hardaway. This was Bugs's Bunny. But that's where the name comes from. It sticks from here. And the cartoon he made was Harum Scarum, one of many of these rabbit hunting cartoons with every one of them, the character has a different voice, a different personality, a different look, but he's still crazy and kooky and pulling all kinds of gags on the hunter. Tex Avery, who I mentioned before, had his shot at making one of these cartoons in 1940, and that cartoon was called A Wild Hare. And in that cartoon, the Elmer character was now solidified like that, a little more the way we know him today. And the Bugs Bunny character was now solidified a little bit more as just a little bit. They'd still do some more evolution on the character, but basically it was closer. And in this cartoon, Mel Blanc gives him the voice that's, again, closer to the character that we know today. Tex Avery supplied the famous signature line, "What's up, Doc? What's up, Doc?" Because that was a thing that Tex Avery in his high school years, everybody in his high school addressed everybody by the word Doc, by Doc. "Hey, Doc, how you doing, Doc?" There are many Tex Avery cartoons before this one where other characters are calling each other Doc. It was a Tex Avery trait. But but applied here, it stuck. "What's up, Doc" became a signature line. This cartoon was nominated for an Academy Award, and it was a sensation with the audiences and theater owners who flooded the switchboards at Warner Brothers for more of these Bugs Bunny cartoons. And so by the next year, Bugs Bunny was pretty much his own series. Here's a trade ad where Warner's is basically, or Leon is basically thanking Mr. and Mrs. America, for making him a star. And he was a star. By 1941, Bugs Bunny was the most popular character in cartoons, eclipsing Popeye and Donald Duck, but only by a hair, no pun intended. And it was great timing because this was what we needed. We were about to enter World War II, and Bugs Bunny represented the everyman, the American. We're not going to take this. You bomb our harbor, we're going to fight back. That's what Bugs Bunny was. That's what Popeye was, actually. In some ways, that's what Donald Duck was. The directors at Warner Brothers. Well, in a nutshell, with the time we have remaining, we'll just talk quickly about some of them. Chuck Jones, kind of first and foremost. I have him here because here he is in front of some of his storyboards for a Sniffles cartoon around 1940. He was made a director. He finally got to the director's seat in 1939. And for the first 3 years or so of his directing career, he didn't get the message. He was not paying attention to what his friends were doing. And even Leon didn't say anything for 3 years. He made a large series of very soft cartoons, very much in the manner of Disney. So much so, some of his Merrie Melodies could have easily been released as silly symphonies. Tom Thumb in Trouble is pretty much the story of Tom Thumb. This is one of many that Chuck did during this period, while Avery and Tashlin and Freleng and Clampett were making absolutely bonkers Looney Tunes. Jones was making these little soft films, full animation, beautiful to look at. But he wasn't with the program. And in 1942, Leon pretty much called him on the carpet and said, "I'm getting prizes for Bugs Bunny. We're getting bookings because of Daffy Duck and Porky. I need you to bring what you're doing to the level or we're going to have to part company." He threatened him. So immediately, Chuck Jones changes his tune and starts. Here's the thing. Leon did not put a heavy hand on his animators about what they could do. As long as they came in on time, on the schedule, on budget, he was cool. He was cool, but there were occasional times where he stepped in, like this with Jones. He had to step in with Jones over his very first new wave cartoon here, The Dover Boys, a parody of the 1890s, early 1900s Rover Boys young adult novels that every boys and girls read way back at the turn of the century. Very old-fashioned, very corny. Jones made a spoof of those, and he did it in a very stylized way, in a way that animation wouldn't even begin doing for another 7 or 8 years. Animation at that time was Bugs Bunny and Donald Duck, and It wasn't stylized humans like this. In stylized animation, he created something in this film that's still used today called smear animation, where we'd pop from one pose to another with one frame in between of a smear. This is one of those smears right here. And you would never see this, watching the movie, but you'd feel the effect. You'd feel the characters move very, very quickly because of this technique. Jones was innovating. This cartoon was quite an innovation. He had to be called in one more time by Schlesinger. Said, no. Do what Avery's doing. Do what Freleng is doing. Don't do this. Jones would get his chance to innovate later. But I like that he popped from pose to pose, so to speak, in this case. Jones had a great career at Warner's, coming into his own. He really evolved into the filmmaker that we know of him in the 1950s, almost 1950 on the dot up. He's the Chuck Jones that people remember. In 1949, he created The Roadrunner and Coyote. In 1947, he created Pepe Le Pew and made those cartoons. Marvin the Martian was introduced in a Bugs Bunny cartoon, and every time you see Marvin the Martian, that's a Chuck Jones cartoon. Each director had their own characters that they worked with exclusively, while using a certain amount of the characters they shared amongst them. I guess the shared characters would be Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, Porky Pig, and Sylvester. But almost all the other characters you can think of from Warner's were basically handled by whatever that director was that created that character. Bob Clampett, one of my absolute tip-top favorite directors. What can I say? He did some of my greatest cartoons, some of my most favorite cartoons. He is the person who gets credit for creating Tweety, Tweety Bird. This is years before Tweety was teamed with Sylvester. That's another story, which I'll get to. But Clampett's Tweety was a little more violent than the later Tweety we all know and love, but it's Tweety nonetheless, who taw putty tat. Made some great, great cartoons during his tenure. He left in 1946. Hang on a moment. Oh, okay. I mentioned Friz Freleng earlier. What a career. I love talking about Friz. I really admire his career. As I mentioned, worked at Disney in the 20s, was hired by Harmon-Ising in the 30s, remained with Warner Brothers all the way till their doors closed in 1962. In between that time, consummate director, provided cartoons that were of the period. He was making them perfectly. If the early 30s required imitation Mickey Mouse, he did imitation Mickey Mouse like Mickey Mouse. If the cartoons of the 40s were screwball and crazy, he did some of the funniest, wacky cartoons of that period. And in the 1960s, when he was let go by Warner Brothers, after winning several Oscars with his cartoons for Warner Brothers, I might add, he created the Pink Panther. And the Pink Panther cartoons, which he luckily had a piece of, he owned 25% of it. Luckily allowed him to retire as a wealthy man. Otherwise, he wouldn't have. But the Pink Panther cartoons pretty much set the stage for the 1960s style of cartoons. He did everything, this guy. Here's a lobby card of one of his Sylvester and Elmer. I guess Elmer was a character all the other directors did as well. Freleng was the person who teamed up Tweety and Sylvester. Sylvester was a character that Freleng created. And when Clampett left the studio, he took over the orphan canary and teamed him with the Sylvester character. And wow, they won 2 Oscars. They were probably second to the Bugs Bunnies in terms of popularity at that time of cartoons. Speedy Gonzalez was definitely I would say almost a co-creation of Freleng's, co-created with Robert McKimson, who I'll talk about in a second. Here's Frank Tashlin. Unfortunately, Frank Tashlin didn't create any characters for Warner Brothers. He directed some hilarious, Porky Pig, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck cartoons, but actually didn't create any characters with any lasting power. Here's one of his print cartoons from the 1930s where he signed them Tish Tash. And this is, of course, one of his many, many, many live action movies that he made in the 50s and 60s. This film was written and directed by Frank Tashlin. Robert McKimson was the best animator at the studio back in the 30s. And when Tashlin left the studio in 46, McKimson got tapped to be a director. I understand it was a reluctant thing. He was perfectly content to be an amazing character designer and animator for the studio. But he had done so much, he really was next in line. And they gave him that unit. And before long, he created characters that are still well known and beloved today, like Foghorn Leghorn and the Tasmanian Devil. Anytime you see the Foghorn Leghorn or the Tasmanian Devil, those are Robert McKimson cartoons. McKimson even drew this poster for a lobby poster. If you want to know what McKimson's art style was like, it's pretty much this. I will put an asterisk there and say that there's a picture at the bottom there of Sniffles the mouse, and that's Chuck Jones, and Tweety, that's the Clampett Tweety, actually, in that image there. But everything else, the other characters, Bugs, Porky, Daffy, and Elmer, those are all actual drawings of McKimson's. And this is a spectacular model sheet by Chuck Jones for a cartoon called Feed the Kitty. Highly recommended. Another director of note at Warner Brothers is Arthur Davis, who was one of, again, like McKimson, was one of the top animators at the studio. He'd actually had been an animator and director at the mostly unknown and completely forgotten Screen Gems studio of the 1930s. The Screen Gems studio did the Crazy Cat cartoons and Scrappy cartoons and Color Rhapsodies. They're actually showing some of those on MeTV. They have a show on at 7 a.m, plug, called Tune In With Me. And they show some of those. They show Warner Brothers cartoons, Fleischer cartoons, but they also show occasionally these weird Columbia cartoons that were made in the 30s. And Davis directed some of those, and they're really good for what they are. They're, silly symphony knockoffs. When that studio closed, he moved over to Warner Brothers and became one of the top animators for Friz Freleng in his unit. Loved it. Did it forever. And again, an opportunity came when Clampett left the studio for another director to be there. They promoted from within. Arthur Davis got that, and did a whole bunch of cartoons that a lot of the fans today, I call them cult cartoons. They're all pretty wild and really have a personality that isn't. It's a little different, a little different flavor, and that's what's great about the Warner Brothers cartoons. They had these different units working on these same characters like Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, but yet each director had was able to do his own thing, to inject his own personality into these cartoons. I think that's part of the magic of why the Warner cartoons work. They're not only really, really funny, but you really know someone, a human being, not a robot, not AI, worked on these things, that real people did these. They're handcrafted. They really are little mini masterpieces and cinema gems, I like to say. Anyway, that's my little Warner Brothers overview. Keith, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry. That was just a fascinating history, not only of animation, but of film as well. Next week, when we're going to get together, we're going to make a part 2 of this. We're going to invite Willie Ito, a 6-year veteran of Warner Brothers Animation, where he worked at the old Termite Terrace for those last 12 months of that studio's life, working with such directors as Chuck Jones as Friz and Friz Freleng as well. So we look forward to that interview as well. Thank you again, Jerry. It's been a tremendous recording listening to you.
Thank you. I hope it works. Thank you.